After his math teacher constantly insults him in class, a high school student decides to take her down in the most unthinkable way, and it's savage. Nothing makes high school a more dreadful experience than a horrible teacher. Most of us would have had that one class we feared walking into because we knew they'd be there, and this former student is no exception. Redditor Johnny_Provolone was constantly berated by his algebra teacher and saw no end to her taunts for almost half his academic year. But one day he decided to put an end to it and shared his incredible story on Reddit's Pro-Revenge subreddit 15 years later. Johnny was 18 when it all happened. The senior high school student claimed he'd never been the brightest student. Nevertheless, he never got any detention and maintained a clean student record. Still, he didn't escape that one teacher's sarcastic outlook on him, particularly when he attempted to ask questions regarding the lessons. The student had no idea why his teacher, whom he preferred to call Mrs. Frank, treated him differently. Mrs. Frank was considered the golden child among the administrators, so taking her down wouldn't happen without going through tons of smirks and grumpy faces that supported her. Johnny had issues understanding algebra, which was also one of his worst subjects. According to him, even the fundamental questions that seemed answerable to some were rocket science to him. The real problem sparked up whenever he would interrupt Mrs. Frank to clear certain doubts on the lesson, and to his surprise, the teacher constantly mocked him in front of the class. "And here comes the slow boy again," she'd taunt Johnny. Mrs. Frank would often say things like, "Really? We have to go extra slow for you today, don't we?" The boy kept calm, but like how every horror story has a twisty climax, Mrs. Frank did have her bad days shortly. At one point, Johnny thought she'd said enough and walked to the staff room. However, the admins usually let go of the matter with a vague check on Mrs. Frank's behavior in class. Sometimes she would get away by staging her best behavior towards the students in front of the admin and then return to her normal sarcastic mode when they weren't checking on her. For around half his academic year, Johnny dealt with a terrible teacher he could never look up to, so he decided to take things into his own hands and headed to the local Radio Shack, a renowned electronics store, and bought a recorder. He only focused on one mission during Mrs. Frank's class from the next day onward: recording her insults secretly. He'd even provoke her so that he made up for the lost time and get at her when the right time came. This went on for the rest of the year. One day, he attended Mrs. Frank's class when he again interrupted her for a little subject-related clarification. "I've been teaching here for over 10 years and that was the single dumbest question I've ever heard come from anyone's mouth," boasted Mrs. Frank and refused to answer. Her response burned down Johnny's senses, and in mere seconds, he calmly got up, packed his stuff, and stormed to the nurse's office. He intended to dismiss himself from school as he was 18, which was allowed. When he got home, he compiled all the recorded tapes into what he described as one glorious masterpiece. He headed back to school the next day to show the administrators. First, he played a couple of recordings to the principal, who demanded more witnesses to be present. The following day, the principal, vice principal, board directors, and even a local police officer were present at the principal's office, as was Mrs. Frank. Johnny had never been so nervous all his life when he was called down to the office. Some of the most dramatic minutes of the student's life followed. He watched the staff gape as the tapes were being played. And then there was Mrs. Frank, who went from confident to speechless on realizing she'd nailed her coffin. A sense of pride bubbled within Johnny, seeing how his rude teacher roasted herself in front of the most paramount educational personnel in the district. "I think we have heard everything we need to. Thank you," the principal told Johnny and asked him to leave the room. However, Mrs. Frank was yet to experience the most brutal blow in her career. She exited the room, and it was the last time Johnny had ever seen her with her teary eyes. He flaunted his wicked smile at her for having given her more than what she bargained for. Around 15 years later, he narrated the incident online, and several people flooded his story with incredible responses, and some were curious to know what happened to Mrs. Frank after that. "That was beautiful." Question: was she widely disliked in the school? Asked one curious user. "And do you know what happened to her?" the person added. "Yes, it was known that if you were going to her class, you were in for a bad time," Johnny recounted, adding, "This took place towards the end of my senior year, so I was only in the school for about another month. This was also over 15 years ago, before all this social media stuff, so I haven't heard since." Meanwhile, some people wondered if Johnny returned to school and continued taking algebra after that day. Surprisingly, he returned to school the next day, and Mrs. Frank was nowhere to be found. She was fired, and a black mark in her career made it impossible for her to land any other teaching job in the district. She was financially ruined, lost most of her connections in the teaching niche, and was never heard of again. As for the tapes, Johnny said, "I do not still have the tapes. It was in the administration's best interest to keep them in case she sued for false termination. Yes, I took algebra as a senior, and throughout all of my years of school, I had tutoring," he concluded.